and we're going to reminisce about the early days of wellness. So say hi to the folks.
Hello there. Good to catch up with you. That's for sure. It's been far too long.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you were the first professional person, I think, maybe Marty Rossman too, that I encountered before I even moved to California. I did my residency at Hopkins and I was preparing to open the Wellness Center. And somehow or other, you found me and tracked me down, and you were interviewing me for, was it for Mind as Healer, or was it prior to that? It was an
No,
article?
it was for Mind as Healer.
And how did, how, give me some background on what led you to that.
I'm not, it was so long ago, I'm not certain, but somehow I first heard the term wellness. And it may have been Marty Rossman, it may have been Marty Rossman who said, well, if you're interested in wellness, you need to talk to Dr. John Travis. And I said, who's that? and that's what led me to track you down and want to talk with you, because I was intrigued by that word because it was such a novel idea.
Yeah.
And then when you moved out here, I remember coming to your clinic in Mill Valley and being amazed by what you were doing and what you were thinking about. I mean, that was like the mid 70s, So this was really quite
75, 76.
Yeah, that was quite radical. It was really quite radical in that time.
We had to spell wellness on the phone to people.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure. It's still, I mean, if you think about it, it's still a term that I think is not really well understood by people. It's used a lot, but I'm not sure people realize what they're really saying when they use the term. That, we're really looking at.
No, go ahead. We've got a time lag here that's interfering with our back and forth.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm saying that it really has a focus on health. It's not about disease. And that is still today, 2019, a radical idea in health and medicine, to focus on health rather than disease, and that clearly health is much more than the absence of disease. And what are the conditions that create wellness and create optimal health and longevity? We're just beginning to really think about that in a very positive way. So you were this is probably 50 years ahead of his time.
Well, it was almost 50 years ago that, well, it's more than 50 years ago that Dunn published his book. It was 61.
Yes, absolutely.
60 years. Actually, he published the papers in the late 50s, and he gave the talks that became the book in the late 50s. So it's the 60th anniversary of his coming out with it.
I did not realize that.
Yeah. And I found the book 10 years later in 71 at the Hopkins Medical Bookstore. And I thought wellness was a silly word and it would never catch on, and was reluctant to even use it.
Right.
So now more background of how did you get into this field in the first place? Like, what was your original training or interests? Are you a California boy or what?
Well, I was actually finishing up. I dropped out for a year. I was at UCSF and was between the PhD and MD part of my program. Dropped out for a year because it was the 60s. You had to go wandering, and I did. I went wandering through Europe, the Near East, North Africa. And this is a bit of a long answer to your question, but I found myself on an island in Greece. And the island is Tinos, Tinos. And it turns out that Tinos has a chapel on that island. And it's like the Greek Orthodox version of Lourdes. It's a place where for the Greeks, miracles have occurred. And I was there in August and I was living under a fig tree on the beach. And all these people began descending on this island and they were going to this chapel. Now, I didn't see eyes regenerate or limbs regenerate or anything like that, but I did see people that were in excruciating pain who went into this chapel and did whatever they did and would come out and be pain-free. People that could barely walk due to arthritis and rheumatic disorders come out and were walking. People who had lost the ability to speak were speaking. People's vision improved. They weren't seeing 20/20, but their vision improved from near blindness to clarity of vision. So when I came back to UCSF, I said, this is not the biology I've been learning. This is not biological, reductionistic, deterministic biology. Something else is going on here. It's really that their beliefs, their mind, if you will, the psychological issues really are holding sway over biology. And at that time, Joe Camilla was doing research in biofeedback. And a colleague of his, Dr. Elma Green, remember at the Menninger Foundation, had done some research with yogis who could inflict pain and control bleeding and pain, but he did it in a way that it wasn't very rigorous and it was criticized. And this, again, is the mid-70s, when, if you remember, that the medical textbooks said there was the autonomic and the voluntary nervous system, and they ran like train tracks. They did not interact. They were on parallel and non-intersecting directions. And something about, I said, wait a minute, that's not right, because if you hold your breath, which is voluntary, at some point oxygen drops and you involuntarily start to breathe. Or if you keep your eyes open for a long period of time, which is voluntary, the lens dries out, you'll blink, and that's involuntary. So I knew that there was a connection between these two, but how did that have a bearing on what Elma Green was demonstrating? So we brought about 4 or 5 of these, what we called adept meditators, in 1975, 76, into the lab at UCSF and had them demonstrate under very rigid laboratory conditions that they could control bleeding and pain. And I'll end on this one story, because Jack Schwartz, who is a meditation teacher, had learned his voluntary control. As he was a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp. He'd been in the Dutch underground, was captured, tortured, put into a prison camp. And in the course of being tortured, he had a vision. And when he came out of the vision, he said to the guard who had been torturing him, "I love you." The guard thought he was crazy, but they left him alone. And from that point on, his ability to control bleeding and pain got better and better. So his trick was he would take a large diameter, unsterilized knitting needle and push it completely through his bicep. Now, this is one of those do not do this at home situations. And there's a major arteries in the left arm and it didn't matter to him where he was poking it through. In fact, a couple of times he did hit the artery and he would push it all the way through. And it takes a lot of effort, and don't try it, but it takes a lot of effort to push a large diameter sharpened knitting needle through your arm. And when he wasn't meditating, he felt pain, he would bleed, he had normal reaction time, the electrical activity in his brain got very high frequency, he was in pain. But when he was meditating and did it, it looked as though he was on a beach in Hawaii. Brain waves were slow, respiration was normal, heart rate was slow and regular, galvanic skin conductance was steady. And he said that when he pressed a needle through his arm, he could feel a sensation, but he said, it's like pressing my other finger on my arm. I'm aware of a sensation, but it's not sharp and shooting. So anyway, we did that and we published it and demonstrated unequivocally that these individuals had the ability to control bleeding and pain and infection in a way that was unheard of at the time, and to many, even to the present time, is still controversial. But we were able to prove that at that time, and it was really the beginning of a quest to say, what is health? How does the mind-body interact, and how do we create more optimal states of health rather than succumbing to disease? So that's my long introductory answer to your question.
Well, I got to know Jack, and then I saw the video of him doing that Elmer made. And didn't he at one point say, which side would you like me to stop bleeding first? And he could control the wound entry?
Yes, he could. And we went to the Canadian Broadcasting Company. We went to the University of Montreal and McGill in Montreal. And Jack, for the last time, said, I'm going to do it one more time. And he said, I consider it to be a circus trick, because the whole idea is not to teach people how to inflict pain on themselves and stop bleeding and pain, but it's to show that the mind has sway over biology, that we are not physical beings, we're spiritual beings who have a physical presence. So he did it for a very last time in Montreal. And I remember one of the doctors, just as he was about to put the needle through his arm, said, is that sterile? And Jack said, oh, I forgot. And he took it, put it on the floor, rolled it around under his foot, then picked it up with junk hanging from the needle and pushed it through his arm.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, and you know, the intermediate after that was I somehow a writer from Playboy got wind of this experiment and came to interview me, and I never realized how many people in the military or prisons read Playboy because then I got inundated with letters saying, well, I can do that. So we then got people, one person came from Alcatraz, he was a prisoner in Alcatraz, and he had learned to control bleeding and pain because he was a drug smuggler. He'd been shot, he'd been stabbed, and in order not to cry out or bleed to death, he had to learn how to control bleeding and pain. And so he did his thing, and we published a picture of him with the article when we published it in a peer-reviewed journal. He would put bicycle spokes through his face. So he'd take 3 bicycle spokes, put them through one side of his face, through his mouth, and out the other side. And the photograph in the article makes him look like a cat with steel whiskers. And his mouth is open. He's clearly in a trance. But you can see the bicycle spokes crossing inside his mouth. So that was his trick. But we learned a lot from these people about the mental state that they had to get into in order to allow this to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now, who coined the term, or when did it start getting used, of mind-body medicine?
You know, I'm not sure.
To the 70s.
Not sure. I mean, I used mind-body, meaning as one word with an uppercase M and uppercase B, in Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer. That was 1977. So I can't claim, I don't think I was the first person to use that, but I think it was the first time. The book was such a bestseller that I think it was the first time that really put the concept of mind-body in the minds of people, that this is real. It demonstrated that in heart disease and cancer, arthritis, irritable bowel syndrome, all of the functional disorders that we learned about from the point of view of a kind of reductionistic biology had stress and psychosocial factors and belief systems underlying how they happened, their etiology, but also in how people would cope with them and overcome them. So I think the term mind-body from the mid-70s on really caught on. It became increasingly acceptable. When the first Office of Alternative Medicine was created, this would have been in the early 1990s at NIH. They actually used the term mind-body with M and uppercase B to designate a major research area. That was the first time it probably had national prominence and acceptance.
And I've always, I went up to Candace Purse at National Wellness Conference after a keynote when he was talking about it. This was probably the late night. It was when she was going back into research, she had dropped out. And I said, well, isn't it really emotions? You know, was it a bunch of academic head cases that started using just mind? It's mind, body, emotions, it seemed to
Yes,
do with it,
yes.
but hasn't caught on. But
Well,
she
I
agreed
think,
with me.
there was a term, as you know, remember Robert Ader, who is the University of Rochester professor of psychiatry, wrote a book, a book of readers called Psychoneuroimmunology.
Ah, yes. Okay.
That was in the that would have been in the 80s, the late 80s. And that caught on for a while, a bit of a mouthful. And I think I know why people didn't use it, because it's a bit of a mouthful. But that connection from the mind to the nervous system to the immunology, that connection began to be threaded together. And the research they did was very compelling. They did it with animals and demonstrated that animals could regulate and change their immune response. Individual people could do the same. They also did the early research demonstrating that during periods of high stress, like exams in colleges, that students would have a higher incidence of colds and flus. So they were compromising their immune system because of stress, more susceptible to infections and colds. And so that idea, the concept that clearly there's an interaction here, was gaining greater acceptance. And now we have, the whole epigenetic realm, which is the last 7 or 8 years of my research, which is not only do we control our physiology, our nervous system, our biochemistry, but we actually influence our genes, that we have a direct, measurable, significant impact on genetics. That to me is astounding.
Yeah. And now we got to throw in the microbiome in our guts. And are they really running the show?
Well, yes, and I think that you're absolutely right. Part of epigenetics is the fact that you basically have, in our research now, we say you need 3 sets of biomarkers in order to really know who you are individually. So there's the genetic markers. It's like a blueprint. So it's like a house. It's a design. Then you have the blood, the complete blood chemistry. And that's like building the house. It's the structure. It says, here's what the blueprint is saying. Here's how it's manifesting in your bloodstream. Then you have the microbiome. So the whole intestinal tract is like living in the house. It's like when all is said and done, you have the blueprint, you have the blood feeding your organs, and the byproduct and aftermath of that is manifest in the biome. So if you have all 3, then you have this complete genetic profile. And as you know, I mean, the microbiome is fascinating because we have about 23 to 25,000 genes. But if you look at the gastrointestinal tract, the microbiome, there's 30 to 40 trillion cells, 30 to 40 trillion bacteria, viruses, cells, genes in the intestinal tract. So it's like we're an organism carrying around this incredibly complex system, and we're beginning to learn how we have a profound interaction with that. The mind-body area, in terms of changes in the intestinal tract, creating depression, and depression having a direct and measurable impact on the human biome, is becoming very well accepted and very well known. So this is a whole new level of the mind-body.
Yeah. It's probably people watching this 20 years, 30 years from now will think, what crude understandings we had.
Yes. It's true. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
What changes we've seen in our 50 years in the field, and wow. Yeah.
True. Yeah. Very true.
Well, now I've associated your work more with the health promotion side of things, which seemed to be a much more acceptable route than my wellness work was, partly because people couldn't spell the word.
Yeah, right.
But then the medical model took over in the 80s, largely due to Don Ardell's promoting it in hospitals.
Yes.
And they co-opted the term to where, as you said earlier, it doesn't really mean anything. Close to what Halbert Dunn had in mind, the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. It's been medicalized, and the number one hit in Google is a dog food. So
Oh, I didn't realize that.
yeah, there's a 500 million hits if you Google wellness, but the Wellness Pet Food Company comes up top every time.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah, so I consider dropping the word back in the 80s, but we had a book with the title,
Yeah,
wellness title, so it was problematic.
yeah.
But let's say more about the channels that you've moved through, and the relationship between mind, body, and health promotion and wellness, and these different sort of silos. Still, they're not that well integrated, I don't think.
Well, they're not. I mean, I've passed through these different rooms in the mansion, if you will, but the corporate work came very naturally out of this interest in mind, body, and interest in health. And in the early 80s, I realized a light bulb went off that who's interested in health? I mean, you went through this. Who's interested in wellness? Who cares? My division chief said, stay focused on becoming expert in a nice disease. And I thought, God, that sounds boring. And I was always much more interested in health and what's good about the human being, not some dreaded little disease and its biochemistry. So it occurred to me that it was the private corporate sector, because large corporations have hundreds of thousands of employees. They have no vested interest in health. If an employee is sick, they're a liability. They're not an asset. If they're well and functioning, then they're productive and high performing, and they're an asset. So in the early 80s, Robert Beck, who was the head of human resources at IBM, had the idea. He was the first person to think that a company should have a health, or I think he actually referred to it as a wellness program. So he got 5 of us to come and meet with him at IBM in Armonk, New York, at their corporate headquarters, and to design a wellness program for IBM. This would have been the early 80s. And in the early 80s, then we created this set of schematic. They sent it out for bid. Who's going to deliver it? No one responded. There was not a single response. So a friend and I created a company to basically provide the services for the schematic, the set of specifications we had designed. That program was bought by Johnson & Johnson and became the kernel of the Live for Life program. So when that happened, this would have been 1985, I decided, okay, my one success in the business world, I'm going back to academia. And Bob Beck changed from IBM to Bank of America, became head of human resources at Bank of America in San Francisco. And so he and I began, again, kind of talking to each other. And the idea of bringing some people from the corporate sector and the academic medical side together to think about what kinds of programs create health for people in a corporation, in a corporate environment where there's a vested interest and stake in health. They pay all the medical bills, so they've got an interest in keeping people from collecting on those. So we started the Corporate Health Improvement Program, CHIP, in 1986 at UCSF, and he called up maybe 10 of his colleagues. The initial companies were IBM, Bank of America, Levi Strauss, Shackley, I've forgotten what other companies were early members. Ran that for 4 years. Then I took it to Stanford from 1990 to 2002. And at that time, we kind of shifted gears. And because we're in Silicon Valley, we got Apple and American Airlines, Oracle became a member. But anyway, what we did is we met twice a year. And the program is still going, by the way.
Mm.
We meet twice a year with the medical directors, and we develop programs. They tell us what is their biggest issue. Is it initially it was hypertension, cholesterol, et cetera. What's your biggest issue? Then we develop research projects with them, with their own employees, train their staff to deliver it, and generate clinical and cost outcomes. So at the end of it, they know that their back pain program, so Ford is a member. So the back pain program we developed at Ford, they knew it worked for their employees. Their medical department had delivered it. And now it's the dominant way in which Ford Motor Company deals with back pain with that population. So in 2002, this is now going through this fast, but 2002, I brought it back to UCSF, where it still is, and have continued. And a lot of the same companies are still members. Ford, IBM, Dow, Lockheed Martin, PepsiCo. And again, same model. Twice a year we meet, develop projects, and go forward. And what we've done now, this is now 30 years, long time. And we've developed a body of knowledge demonstrating unequivocally that you can improve the health and well-being of your employees, improve performance, improve productivity, and reduce your medical cost. That's what we've demonstrated over 30 years. So it's a very practical application of health in a setting where people have a vested interest in health.
Mm. Yeah. Well done.
It has been exciting, to see the impact on the companies. And, right now we're looking at pain and the epigenetics of pain, and how, this takes me back to my roots into the mid 70s, of how radically different pain is. Not physical, it's psychological more often than it is physical. And how can people learn how to adapt and cope with pain without opioids? We're finally reaching the end of the opioid addiction crisis. We're coming to realize that's not the answer. So then it's all the non-opioid approaches: meditation, massage, acupuncture, physical activity, diet. All of these things that have a profound impact on pain is one of the areas we're looking at. We're also looking at epigenetic testing to determine, what kinds of conditions would executives have, and what can we teach them how not to get irritable bowel syndrome, how not to develop heart disease, how not to succumb to pain. So those are kind of two of our newest areas of research. And personalized nutrition, using the kind of testing we were talking about earlier to create diets that are perfect for individuals, not this diet versus that diet. I mean, as well as I do, you go to a conference, you hear about the ketogenic diet, high fat, low fat, Mediterranean diet, the celery fast diet. I mean, everything under the sun. And to me, it's all nonsense. There's no such thing as a perfect diet. There's the perfect diet for you. And the testing that we're doing can help you figure that out.
Yeah.
Then we've really got a solution.
And has Sarno's work fit in there at all? He's pretty radical on the pain subject.
On the pain subject, yes. He had early insights into the fact that, that the neurotransmitters were not all there was to pain. It's like, what's upstream from the neurotransmitters? And upstream from the neurotransmitters are belief systems and meditation and biofeedback and autogenic training, and all of the things that people can do to modify, reduce the initial trigger to the neural pathways, to the pain response. Yeah.
And now, you mentioned Joe Camilla, and I got interested in biofeedback early on, and Art Gladman showed me his equipment, and I got hooked up with Autogenics. I had one of their first temperature machines, and it was actually demonstrated on the 60 Minutes piece with Dan Rather. I think that was the first time biofeedback got national coverage. But is Joe still with us? He's older than us, isn't he, or was?
He is. As far as I know, he's still alive. I think he's since retired from UCSF. but he's still around. As far as I know, he's still alive. Art Gladman died a number of years
Right.
ago. But Gladman Hospital was a very innovative psychiatric hospital, but they did innovative programs. They didn't have a drug them up, lock them up model. It was very much of a health model,
Yeah.
focused on adolescents and giving them programs and skills development and the use of biofeedback and meditation. That, again, those were in the late 70s, early 80s. That was radical at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. I met Art probably 74 before I moved out here. And Todd McCarea was with him. Is he still around?
Todd died
He did.
a number of years ago. Quite young, actually. And, he'd been very active in NORML, the legalization of marijuana, way before we got
Yeah.
anywhere near the legalization that
Wow.
now occurred. He'd be proud to see that his work finally was brought to
Exactly.
fruition. He died before he saw that
Yeah.
really happening, which is unfortunate because he really was a leader in that field.
Yeah. So where do you see things going in the future for yourself and for the big picture?
Well, I think,
If I can put you on the spot.
well, interesting question, especially coming from you. Um, I think we're going to see clearly a shift toward health, because literally the kind of disease focus that characterizes medical care today is unsustainable. There is not enough money, there's not enough technology, not enough people to treat the amount of disease that we have. And so that's very clear. I mean, we're just hitting a dead end. The United States, just take the United States as an example, we spend twice as much per person per year on medical care than any other nation on earth. We spend nearly 12, I think 12 or $13,000 a year per person on medical care for the people that have insurance. Germany spends about 10,000, so it's about half. Yet, despite the fact that we spend the most for the youngest average age population on the planet, our outcomes, World Health Organization outcomes, the United States versus the 20 post-industrial nations or even lower, is the United States ranks 37th in disease outcomes in terms of heart disease, cancer, suicides, homicides, birth deaths. That is the same as Bosnia, which spends about 1/100th of what we spend on medical care. We rank the same as Bosnia. So this is an untenable direction. Secondly, the cost of pharmaceuticals is completely out of control. I mean, big pharma has run medicine for far too long. Most prescriptions in the United States are 2, 3, 4 times more costly than the identical brand pharmaceutical anywhere else in the world. So people are going into Canada, Mexico, and into Europe to get their prescriptions filled at a fraction of the cost that you can fill it in the United States. Third factor is that we still have, even with the remnants of Obamacare, we still have more than 20 million people without medical coverage in the United States. The only other nation on earth that does not have universal care is South Africa. Every nation on earth has universal access to primary care. So our medical care system is not a medical care system. It's a disease management industry. I've written about that in my books a number of times. But I think that's changing because we're recognizing we have to prevent the diseases before they get so bad that we have to treat them with increasing cost and with a very bad return. Our interventions are just not working. So there'll be a much greater emphasis on prevention. And we now know how to do it. It used to be a nice phrase like, oh, exercise, eat your Wheaties, run around the block. Well, that's all true, but now we have precise measurements. We have data. We know exactly what our nutrition should look like. We know what stress management techniques are most effective. We know how to influence our own immune system. We know how to influence our own genetic expression. So this information now is getting out into the public. It's becoming more acceptable. You find courses in medical schools now including this information, where it was when we were in school that didn't exist. It was really straight biology and straight reductionistic biology. That's changing radically. So I think the future, I'm actually quite optimistic about it. The other is that the private corporate sector is really taking a lead and realizing that they have a vested interest in health. They need to keep their people healthy. We have a small young population that cannot replenish the workforce that we have. And so we need to keep older workers in their work sites longer. That means having to preserve their health and their mental well-being better than we're doing. So the corporations are really taking the lead on that. And I'm optimistic about the future if we live long enough to see what it becomes. I think there really will be a radical shift into prevention, optimal health, reduction in cost, more inclusive of women, elders, and children, who are the ones that are most disenfranchised from our medical care system now, and it will be universal. Everyone will have access to care. That's my hope.
Yeah.
That's my hope.
Shift gears a bit. I think the last time I saw you, well, one of the first times, I don't know if you remember, we were at a conference at LAX, and I was getting ready to move to some island. Reagan had just been elected. The U.S. was bankrupt. I thought it was all going to come tumbling down. And you said, why don't you consider Costa Rica? Which I didn't even know the difference between that and Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
You said the topsoil was 6 feet deep. Remember that? And I wound up in Costa Rica for 4 years, and the economy didn't collapse. Reagan borrowed from the Japanese or whatever, keep it afloat. But then I remember being on a sailboat with you in the bay, and you were describing your approach to survival on the sailboat, and come a long way from there.
Well, I do remember.
We're still,
Go ahead.
we still have a functioning economy somehow.
Well, I do remember our conversation about Costa Rica. And do you remember Stefan Rechtschaffen? He founded the Omega Institute.
The name is familiar. He's the New York operation.
Omega Institute. Yeah. Yep. He now has a spa in Costa Rica called Blue Spirit. And so he's still carrying on the health model. And I think he's been down there about 5 or 6 years. So he decided to really make Costa Rica his home base. And as far as sailing, I mean, that's still my one and only true skill. I mean, I've been sailing my whole life. I still love it. Living here in Carmel, it's like paradise. Monterey Bay is a marine sanctuary, and the marine life with whales and dolphins and orcas, seals, otters is just heaven. And sailing teaches you a lot. It teaches you about self-subsistence, teaches you about ecology. If you're in a bay and you're throwing junk overboard, it's going to be with you the next day, and it's going to pollute the water that you're using and the water you're swimming in. And you've got to be very careful about water consumption, foods you eat, what you do to maintain your vessel, or you're going to get in trouble. So it's a model of living simply, living in harmony. And at least for me, people say, well, do you meditate? Yes, and I have for a very long time. But the most profound, positive, meditative experience for me is when you're sailing. There is a time when the wind, the currents, the movement of the boat through the water is totally, perfectly balanced, absolutely balanced. It's this moment of equipoise or equanimity. And you can literally steer your boat with one finger. You just have one finger on the wheel touching it, and everything is in perfect alignment, perfect balance, perfect harmony, total silence. Bang. That's a moment of enlightenment, of really touching the higher self, the spirit, whatever we want to call it. So for me, the most moving experiences have been during sailing in the open ocean, like we were on the San Francisco Bay.
So you sail in San Francisco Bay rather than Monterey Bay?
Well, no, I did until I moved. I moved here 7 years ago. Up
Right.
until I moved here, yeah, I was sailing predominantly in
Yeah.
San Francisco Bay, although, crossing down to South America through Tahiti and the Marquesas, the Tuamotus, the South Pacific, through the Mediterranean. So I sail wherever I can, wherever I can get my hands on a boat.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So here we are, 2019, and where will we be with the next generation?
Well, I hope another 10 years doesn't go by before we have a conversation again. But it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 10 years. I think in many ways we're at a tipping point. Certainly global ecology, the message unequivocally is you are at a tipping point. You either make a difference now or it's doom. And I think it will happen within the next decade. Either we will move towards saving the planet. The planet will be fine, by the way. You
Oh
know,
yeah,
you
the
know,
humans,
it's us
the
humans that are
the
safe.
cancer on the
Yeah,
surface.
yeah. When people say save the planet, I say no, the planet's going to be fine. It's going to be here for eons after we're all gone. So it's not save the planet, save
But
ourselves.
a lot of the other species that we, yeah,
Totally agree. And so I think in the next decade, it's really going to force us to do things, not just talk about it, not just read the reports, not worry about global warming and half degree and 1 degree centigrade changes and rising oceans. All of that's going to happen. All of it is happening, and a lot of it is irreversible and already in crisis. But whether or not we have a point where we can turn that back, reclaim, regenerate the earth, our environment, that's going to all come
yeah.
home to roost in the next decade. That's very clear.
And I'm alive to see it happen. And
I think it will. And I think when we talk to each other 10 years from now, we'll go, well, John, we did it.
we'll do a follow up.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Well, it's been a delight, and I'm going to get down there to Carmel and see if I can get a ride on your sailboat soon.
Sounds great to me. You're always welcome.
Well, great. This has been a delight, and we will be in touch. So
This is so
thank
nice.
you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's great to catch up with you. I've always admired your work. You've always been a pioneer, and you haven't stopped. You still are. So I thank you for this conversation.
And you were the earliest inspiration when I thought I was crazy to be doing this. It's someone actually paid attention and wrote about it in a book. I must not be totally.
No, you're in good shape. Ship of fools, but it's okay. It's a good shape.
Great. I'm going to cut the recording here then.
Okay, sounds great, John. Thank you.
Bye.
Wow.